Hello, it says live and recording. Now's the habitual pause where we wait to see if people in chat are responding. Hello! Somebody said hello. Do you hear me? Hello! Okay, good. I'm Alexis Kennedy. As you probably know, I don't know why you're tuning into this thing. Behind me is the other half of Weta Factory, Lottie Bevan, and the tall, dark, elegant gentleman on the sofa to my right, your left, is Ivan Saric, an old friend of mine, who we've basically dragged into the stream in order to perform an experiment on. So we're going to give it the experiment. Say hello, Ivan.
Hello.
Ivan is a long-time gamer, tabletop role player, general geek about town, and also a Cthulhu aficionado and a general enthusiast for cosmic horror. And he has never played Cultist Simulator, despite me telling him a key, I think approximately 10 years ago, before the game was even created. He just sighs deeply when I ever asked him why he hasn't. So I would like to offer you, ladies and gentlemen, the opportunity to explain to Ivan Saric why he should play Cultist Simulator. As he sits there drinking my gin. Any takers? No takers. Okay. Oh no, here we are. The words are delicious. Delicious words.
Delicious one's good.
Yeah? Your delicious words?
Well, I mean, do write me down. I mean,
it's like The King in Yellow, but written by me. Apparently.
Right.
You like The King in Yellow, don't you?
I do.
Okay, so, you know, kill cops with magic. I mean, have you ever killed a cop?
I haven't. No.
Have you ever killed a cop with magic?
No.
Have you ever killed anyone with magic?
No, not to my knowledge.
Great opportunity. Okay. A tough question, many answers. You can summon a dancing bear.
Right.
You can marry worms. That's a lie. You can't marry worms.
Isn't that cruel, though?
Because opium.
Right.
Marrying worms is cruel.
No, bears.
Oh, that's true. Yeah. You can turn into a moth. That is true.
Turn into a moth.
You can turn into a moth. Blood Beast Terror.
I'm almost sold. But
okay, moth almost sold him, folks.
Yes, I think what we're facing, Sergeant, sorry, is a
blood something moth. Shape-shifting. Yeah, you're right. No, Ivan refers to the Blood Beast Terror, the Hammer film, in which it is explained that
Sergeant. I think it's obvious that what we're facing here is a woman that can turn into a giant blood-drinking moth, and it's.
And if you've played the dance of the DLC, you can probably see the linear progression of that idea from that point. Bizarre hobbies, be an opium-addicted stripper who runs a kidnapping ring. Yeah, also true.
But how do you manage it when you're addicted to opium and haven't got any clothes on? Surely it's tricky.
I mean, I don't think opium requires clothes to absorb. You can paint a painting so nice it makes people join your cult.
Oh, well, that's good. Yes, I always wanted a cult.
Fall in love with alien lost gods.
Right.
Yeah. Summon a wound for another sphere of existence to sign your book. That's it. You can summon one of the most powerful spirits in the game to autograph the book that she wrote while she was alive for you.
Right.
Yeah, you know? Yeah. Magic Nuke is not in the game yet. Nothing fits, but it all fits. Turn into flay skin spirit that never stopped dancing.
Right.
Can I get a chance out of 10 if you play this game now?
Well, I have to play it now, don't I?
So that's a 10.
This is all elaborate.
Do you want to give me a deadline?
It's not a deadline.
What?
Yes. I don't allow my boss to force me to give him a deadline.
Well, I'm not your boss.
No, you're not. No. You've got that.
Well, you've lost your deadline.
That haunted. No. only.
Right.
Only if you go to see
Hadestown.
Hadestown.
God damn it! Should we see Hadestown?
Should. We can book.
Yes, somebody says. Okay, we'll do it. Right. Stream. I'm going to talk today about endings and legacies and motivation, and I'm also going to start and finish by talking about perspective and person in interactive narrative. So when you are thinking about interactive narrative, the character is you. No more cool wool. No, it's the problem. The fucking Bluetooth headset isn't reliable.
Okay, sorry. When he says not reliable, what he means is he bugged the batteries and then didn't believe that the batteries were the problem, and we're never apparently allowed to use them again. So just to be clear, that's what's going on there. There
is not only one history. Anyway, as I say, the so if you're reading a piece of interactive fiction or a parser game or a standard CRPG, the pronoun used to refer to the protagonist is generally second person singular, you, which, fun fact, second person singular and second person plural in English, unlike in most languages, are the same word. So it can conveniently refer both ways, to you and to the party, without the rider needing to do any extra work. But I haven't. I've used you in Cultist Simulator. I used I. Some of you have heard me talk about this before. I chose I for a couple of reasons, partly because it resonates more with the source material. You've got a lot of first person sort of mythos and mythos adjacent stories all the way back to Poe. Lots of stuff is written in the first person as a found manuscript. So I wanted to riff off that. But also, one of the things that we realized very early on at Fail Better, back when we were working on a project called Machine Cares, ! That nobody now, ironically, cares about or remembers, was that writing in I has often, for many players, an unexpected distancing effect. And as far as I can tell, this is why. Because if you read a piece of text that says you are in a room being eaten by squirrels, then there's no confusion. It's talking to the you on the other side of the screen. But if it says I, who's it talking about? It can't unproblematically be the player, because the player didn't just write that text. If the player had just written that text, then the player would not now be reading that text and experiencing it for the first time. But if it is the character, that's also slightly disorienting, because the character is I, and you are the character, you are the protagonist. It's a self-insert game. All the choices made are yours. So there's an immediate confusion of identity, which has a distancing effect. A little bit like the Cretan paradox, that all Cretans are liars. If Epimenides the Cretan says this, then it's how can it be true, because all Cretans are liars? But then if it's true that all Cretans are liars, then you've seen the Star Trek episode probably. So the point is that I has that paradoxical effect. And when you are doing, as you're doing in Cultist Simulator, a number of properly revolting things, if you take away the delicate rose-tinted filter of language that obscures them, it's nice to have that little bit of extra distance. We have had some strong reactions to things you do in the game from people, not all positive, and the I provides a little bit of extra distance. But that I is complicated in Cultist. The I, even once you take into account the player and the protagonist, it can sometimes be overlap with the third individual. And I'll come back to that later. Some of you already know what I'm talking about. So endings. Cultist, like Sunless Sea, has this rhythm where you play, things end, and then you start over. Sometimes things end in a way you didn't intend or expect. Sometimes things continue to an ending you'd planned for, and then crescendo. And in Sunless Sea, that was moderately successful. In Cultist, it is, I would say, quite moderately successful. We've done some things that are better again. And the next game, which I'll talk about in a little bit, not what it is, but some of the thoughts I have about it. The next game, I think, will improve on the formula again. So I like having endings after which you continue for a couple of reasons. One is really pragmatic, and that means that is just that if I write a bunch of content, it's nice for it to be played more than once. The first game I made, Fall in London, has basically no ending at all, and that's fucked, because that means that 9 years after I built it, after I don't even run the company anymore, there are still people having to add content to the game because nobody starts over. I mean, people do, but not formally. So that's the really, really pragmatic thing. But the other thing is just the player's intention in a game, when they're role-playing a character, when they're engaging in a fantasy of being somebody else, tends to be subverted by the player's meta goal of completing the game. It isn't always. Some people don't want to finish a game. Some people get lost in side quests and never finish the game because they drift away. Some people do multiple speed runs or challenge plays, or there's lots of things. But basically, you're playing a narrative game. You want to get to the end, and at some point, this tends to subsume other motives and leave less variation. And that cuts out certain kinds of ending. In CRPGs, you often get a sort of gag choice where the NPC you're talking to will say, do you want to continue with your quest then? Or do you want to retire and live as a pig farmer? And if you say, I do actually want to really live as a pig farmer, you'll get a fade to black and then you'll reload. So it's a good gag, but it's fundamentally a gag choice. So I wanted to give people a little bit more room to choose endings to their stories that didn't occur in the place the story normally ends. So that it was a valid choice in some way, either to continue for the 10 hours, 12 hours needed to finish the game, or to choose an ending earlier on and feel like you got some kind of victory. Being arrested or dying of illness is never a victory in anyone's book, but retiring once you become a senior member of Glover and Glover, or broken a case as the inspector, feels like a sort of a victory. It doesn't always, it also feels like a trap. So cultists, as I never tire of saying, because it's true, and it's also an amazing excuse when I fuck things up. It was an experimental game. I was trying to work out ways this would work and ways it would the people responded to them. And I've learned a lot about the ways that people respond to endings, the ways that people choose endings. And on the other side of this string of post-it notes, I have 7, because there's always 7, common reasons that I find people have for pursuing a particular ending. We're going to talk about each of those. So here's the most basic one. They do it by accident. You're playing the Glover and Glover plotline. You're trying to get promoted. You see there's an option to put passion in the recipe that you think will get you promoted or get you more money. You put that in and you don't realise the text is saying, this is it, you're retiring, you're going to lock yourself into your comfortable life with your books in your fireplace. So some of the people just do it by accident, and that's sometimes great because people go, oh my God, I didn't realise the game could do this, I wonder how many other endings there are. And sometimes people get cross because they've lost an hour and a half of run and they'd only just worked out how to keep alive without losing their mind to despair. So that's the thing. It's the thing that I've learned I need to design around. Whether, and this is the thing about design, right? You can always push in a bunch of different places. So we'll make a design around it is to make the hint really, really clear. I could have a flashing red light and noise and bold text that says, if you make this choice, the game will end. I've done that in some places. I've put, capitals in square brackets. But the thing is, if I do that, if it works 98% of the time, 2% of the time it will fail. And about 100,000 people, I think, have now played Cultist Simulator across various platforms. So that means 2,000 people are in danger of falling into that hole. So that, and also it means the experience of the other 98,000 people is compromised because they don't have this subtlety. They get this one in the game thing. So that's one way to push the design in. Another is to make it less important that that's happened. So if the whole game was shorter, for example, and you tended to play through again and again, the way you do in many roguelikes, most runs would be short. or something like Weird Worlds in Infinite Space, where the playthrough is only intended to be 45 minutes and you start over again. I could do something like that. But that obviously is an enormous change to the general design of the game. But it's a general thing that I could bear in mind for the future. And the third thing is to have different grades of ending, like different buckets you fall through, where you have a staged narrative or where there's a failure state you recover from. But that takes us off into a much wider forest. So that's one reason. Another reason is story. And I'm going to draw a distinction between story and role-playing here, which is just a term of art in a specific context. I mean, story notoriously means a dozen things to a million people. So when I say story, I mean that people choose an ending because they're interested in seeing what happens next in the story. They want to see, is it the game really going to make me retire if I call its bluff? Or they're interested in seeing what happens if they try to ascend while they have an undead lover in tow. They're interested in finding out the outcome. What's behind door number 1? What's behind door number 2? And the other is the more role-playing side of the story is when people are interested in creating an experience that makes sense for them in extending their own personal headcanon. So people could make the same choices with different circumstances. People could say, for example, either I'm interested in calling the game's bluff and seeing whether retirement at Glover and Glover really means game over, or they might say, my character has had a really shit time. They keep getting ill, they're addicted to opium, the weary detective won't leave them alone. I think, honestly, especially because I call them Sad Benji, they really just want to give up and retire and go to the place with the books and the fire and the ticking clock and settle down. Similarly, the ending where you might ascend with your undead lover in tow, perhaps you'll do that because you're interested in seeing, again, whether it has an effect on the way the game considers the plot to work and what the outcome is, or it might be because you have established a role-playing bond emotionally with the NPC you're romancing, and you really want your story to have an ending where you ascend to the Manzas. He's not gone. He might go. It's very hard to tell. He's a sort of enigmatic figure, but I think mostly he went outside to cough because he's enigmatic and polite. Anyway, so those when people talk about being into the story, I think often you get these two different reasons. There's the one which is tell me a story, and the other which is help me make my own story. There's some overlap between them, but those are often reasons people go for those choices. And from that point of view, suddenly the retirement thing becomes potentially more interesting. But then I think to make it work really effectively, I should have put more reasons in the game why you should retire in terms of story. I called back to it more specifically. So I just figured about it once it was there. And the opposite end of this continuum, basically inexplicable to me, but I've learned the hard way that lots of people really care about this reason, is Chivos. So there are plenty of people, I'm sure many in this stream, whose first reaction to being able to ascend with one of the romantic liaison NPCs is to go through all the NPCs in the game and tick off all the achievements. And every game I produce, I've been surprised how much people care about achievements, and every game I put some work in to support it, and it's allowed some people to have a better time than they would otherwise have had. And again, I think from the point of view of narrative design, it almost doesn't matter what goes on, because it's a really easy to get ending. People happily get it with a Chivo. It's a really hard to get ending. The people who have fun chasing Chivos will get it. Or you can always piss people off by making it too difficult, of course. Another reason is as an excuse to play more of the game. So I probably mentioned once or twice or a million times on this stream and elsewhere that I really like FDL, and I've played FDL over the years to a point where I have won a victory with each of the ships. I think there may be some missing. I don't know because I'm not Chivo driven, so I didn't really track it. But I really wanted a reason to play FTL some more, and it felt less hollow or more engaging if I could say to myself, well, I'm going to play it again, but this time with a different victory condition, which I guess is what drives a lot of people to get Chivos as well. So often I think if people really enjoy the game, I think this happens more in cultists with heart players than winter players, but I'm not certain, enjoy the chilling aspect of it. But I know people go back to it sometimes just because they want to play it a bit longer so they find all the endings. And the canonical example of this, of course, is the 3 Ascension endings, Lantern, Forge and Grail, where there is different content to find, so people want to explore their different content. But most of the content in the game, whether you're going for Forge, Lantern or Grail, is fairly similar. You might do painting with one and Glover with another. You might explore different systems, but a lot of it's the same. But what I find is that the people finish the game with one Ascension, probably Forge because it's the easiest, and then they'll take a break and they'll go back and have a crack at another because the game sticks in their mind and they'll get back to it. So I think that's a good reason to have sort of mid-range endings where people feel they have a hope in hell of getting to it rather than crazy. So here's a reason, here's the 7th reason that people do these things. And this 7th reason I learned over the course of making, selling, supporting, ascending cultists is much less relevant than I would have thought. And this will modify my design in the next game I make. And this is mechanical advantage. So my intention was that there'll be lots of situations that would encourage you to make a calculation between role-playing story reasons and mechanical reasons. And that you might, for example, decide to retire so you could get a better start in the next game. Or you might decide that you would raise a child because that would give you different advantages in the next game. And there's 3 reasons, I think, why this didn't work out. One is that mechanical advantage and role-playing sit uneasy together. They can intermesh, they can do useful things. I bet a bunch of you have been playing Stellaris since the last update, and I know at least a couple of you have, and there's a lot of pleasure, especially for the kind of person who plays Stellaris, in meshing the role-playing aspect of choosing a particular empire with the mechanical gameplay advantages you'll get from playing that kind of empire. If playing Spiritualist Empire and getting Psionics really appeals to you, in a role-playing sense, you'll probably also enjoy exercising the psionic mechanics. So, but it's still a bit uneasy. You know, if you really, in role-playing terms, feel your character would never retire, but then you end up wanting to retire because there's a substantial mechanical advantage for your real character, then that could be an issue. And I don't think it's a critical issue, but it just needs more care taken when designing around it than I gave it. Because I didn't quite get, when I was thinking about all the other things in the game, how much that would clash. That's reason 1. Reason 2 is that the system of smaller cycles of events in larger cycles of events in larger cycles of events in yet larger cycles of events, with the largest cycle of events is all the games of Cultist Simulator you play. The next largest cycle is everything that happens in a particular game of Cultist Simulator, and the next largest cycle might be like your Ascension track that you pursue, or your slow upgrade to the highest level of lore. It's a gearing system, and I didn't give enough thought to the way the gearing worked. So it's very difficult to design around something that is mechanically compelling enough to make you play the game for 12 hours, specifically to get an ending for the mechanical advantage it'll give you in the next game. But that advantage is not overwhelmingly broken, inver, powerful. Let me take you through that again. If you play a game for like half an hour and have some sort of ending and then start over, and then playing the game for half an hour gave you an advantage, you'll tend to engineer particular endings. So you might, if you're playing a game that has corpse runs, die a bit closer to base because it's easier to go back, for example. If you have a game that you have to play for 12 hours to complete, and then it has a mechanically advantageous ending, that means your next start is better. That's very, very hard to balance for, because either that start is going to feel pretty trivial if you play for 12 hours to get there, and it's the kind of game you play over and over, or it's going to be overwhelmingly powerful, and then the game's probably too hard without it until you've played until you play 12 hours of it, at which point you're better anyway. So it's really hard to manage that. There's a way around this, which is to use negative rather than positive feedback loops, but I'll come back to that in a sec. So the second thing is the gearing, the balance. And the third thing is just the fucking complexity. So I had a variety of designs, the way legacies would inherit from stories, and you would get different variant legacies based on different details of story. And actually it's just because it's however complicated your game is, or your game with legacy systems will be more complicated. Cultist Simulator is already a really complicated game. So being a complicated legacy system on top of that, my CPU tends to run hot, and the CPU of many of my players tend to run hot. Mark Rosewater, I think it was, famously the big game design honcho at Wizards of the Coast, has either talked about or quoted Richard Garfield, the other big game design name at Wizards of the Coast, as talking about your game has a complexity budget, and just as it has a polygon budget and a time budget and a resources budget, there is only so much complexity it can tend to stand before it starts to collapse under its own weight. So you often need to compromise complexity in one area to avoid that happening. As everything else, there's exceptions for this. If you're making a paradox game, I don't know if there's a practical limit to the amount of complexity you can load on top of it. If you're making a match 3 game, the limit is probably much harder. But there tends to be a sort of internal load-bearing wall sort of limit to how much complexity you want to put. And I haven't really grokked that putting a complex legacy system on top of a complex game would be exponential in terms of the complexity it added. And so I ended up with a simple legacy system, I thought. So mechanical advantages tended not to be a thing. To an extent they are. If you die of starvation, then you always got the option of playing as the bright young thing who doesn't immediately have to worry about funds the next game through. But because if an experienced Cultist Simulator player, you learn very quickly to make funds a fairly trivial problem, that doesn't stick. It's mostly a way to signal to early players that, look, it's okay, it's not going to be quite so rough this time through, but a bit of an easier ride of it. So the big way in which mechanical advantage does work in the game, or is about to work in the game, is, as I said earlier, with a negative rather than a positive feedback loop. So with the Apostle victories, I've gone from, if you manage to achieve this really hard to achieve ending, you can play the game through with an advantage that will make it easier, to, if you manage to finish the game earlier with this really hard to achieve, if you manage to finish the game, it's hard to achieve ending, you can play it through, it'll be much harder this time. So congratulations, Alexis Kennedy. After 9 years making games, you've discovered the concept of New Game Plus. Brilliant. Give the man a fucking award. And as with so much else I've done, I've realized partway through doing a bit of design that I'm actually just rediscovering the design that other better, or at least older designers have done before me. To be fair, this is often because I'm specifically trying to work at the juncture of mechanics and narrative. And a lot of things that look very natural in mechanics-heavy games that don't fit comfortably with narrative-heavy games often need to be interpreted in a slightly different way. But New Game Plus is not, in all honesty, one of those, and I should have thought about it a bit sooner. So this is Apostles, and I'm going to talk about the way the major victories work in outline, because I've talked about it at least a couple of times before, and it's changed every time. And I've now, as of this afternoon, completed the structure for all the major victories, but not one key additional point I'll come to, which means I can talk with confidence about how it's designed, because I just finished it. I just need to write some of the copy. So if you complete a power ascension with the Forge, you can go on to play as an Apostle Istuant, an ignited Apostle, and pursue the Dawnbreaker engine, which enacts many of the intentions of the Forge. If you complete the Grail ascension, the desire, the sensation one, then you get to pursue the Vitulation, the Great Feast, at which you are the centerpiece. And there's a third way you can pursue with the Lantern ascension. Now you'll notice in each of those cases I said you. And this is where I come back to the perspective point at the beginning of this stream. You is the player. The player in the previous game was an occultist who wanted to ascend to immortality. And in this playthrough, you are the occultist's heir or pupil or stooge. In the case of the Lantern ascension, you're just some poor schmo who's had their head filled with crazy dreams that has forced them to become a pawn of this immortal force. So in the first playthrough, you're an occultist. In the second, you're the occultist's heir. And quite significantly, in the second one, it isn't going to end well for the occultist's heir, this you. It is going to end well for the player, because the player will get to pursue one of these rationales, Achievo, or the role-playing delight of watching it play out, or the story of seeing what's going to happen, or lore. I missed out lore. That's a bit of a fucking big deal. Lore diving is slightly different from story. But in the case of the Dawnbreaker engine, you are likely to destroy the occultist's heir who's pursuing this and trying to help their mentor ascend. In the case of the Vitulation, you're probably the centerpiece of the feast, who's actually going to be consumed by the previous master. And the third one, the Lantern ascension, is probably the most depressing of all, not least because you're just this poor schmo who's been manipulated into building this abominable architecture of dream that's going to lure the glory into the Mancers. So the division between the players and the characters' intentions is stark. This is often the case in games. It's particularly stark here because it's not often the case in games. Sorry, it's often the case in the more experimental variety of interactive fiction, something like Plotkin's Shade, for example, where you conspire in your character's destruction. But it's more dissonant still, because you have the original character's intention, the successor character's intention, the player's intention, all of which may be a spectrum of different broadly overlapping intentions that basically mean you keep pushing the cards in the verbs until you get the result you want. So I know I've seen people's feedback. People already find this somewhat confusing in terms of who you is. So I thought, great, I like to do experimental games. Let's push this a bit further. And here's the thing. It's probably going to be possible in the game for the occultist's heir to betray their mentor. And I won't talk about how, because it's much more interesting to leave that as a spoiler. But let's talk about why. So again, we've got three sets of motives here. We've got the original cultist, the one who's becoming immortal, wants to become something even greater, a name. We've got the poor schmo who is serving the occultist, who's conspiring to the ultimate ascension, even at the cost of their own destruction. Got the player who's sitting behind the screen going, okay, this is pretty cool. And the player is the only one here who has any actual free will, although their motivations may closely align with those of the characters in the game. So why would the player, and Lottie actually asked me this, I think, when I was talking through design with her, why would the player want to betray their mentor? Why would the player want the heir to betray their mentor? Why would the player want the heir to betray their mentor and go on and do the original ascension? So if you're doing the victulation, you can go on and do the standard Grail ascension if you manage to betray your mentor. And just see the ending you've already seen. And then be given another opportunity to play through the game again. And then not betray your mentor this time, or potentially betray your mentor yet again. Why would you want to do that? Well, only the most enthusiastic players will want to do it more than like once. That's okay. But the reasons you want to do that are these. You know, some people want to play through the New Game Plus approach again because it is supposed to be more challenging. So you've got the excuse. Some people want to see a story side of it. Some people may shift their opinion from I'm a long, I want to ascend, I want my heir to make me ascend, to now I identify more closely with the heir, and that fucking dickhead who's been trying to turn me into a centerpiece of their feast can do one, and I'm going to become a Grail Long, and then probably in my own personal headcanon come to him. Or maybe they'll just do it by accident. It will happen, you know, statistically at least once. Maybe we want to dig into the lore. And of course, it's none of those reasons. There's always the cheapo. The one thing that implicitly isn't here is mechanical advantage, because it's very hard to think of a mechanical advantage for betraying your master that anybody would actually care about. I could do one. I could say you betray your master and you start again as aspirant, but this time you get an extra funds at the beginning of the game. I mean, I might even do that just as a gag, actually, now having said that on the stream. But this is the level of thing we're talking about, right? If you've played 12 hours of game, probably more than that to get to the point of your first victory. But I think, you know, most people who focus, it takes about 12 hours minimum for them to win. Sometimes much more. Some of you are super fucking smart and did it before then, but most folk. Somebody's done that and then gone through the New Game Plus mode. It's very hard to think of a mechanical advantage that make them care, other than the new Game Plus mode where you play as a name, which I am in no way guaranteeing is ever going to be in the Cultist. Mechanical advantages, endings, perspectives. Who is you? I've written, which is talked about, and Sherlock. Fine. So, a couple of things. First of all, the way the long is, but the enemy long is supposed to work in this game. It is, Jesus Christ. First of all, the way the enemy long is supposed to work in the major victory legacies. And secondly, some thoughts I have about the way I want stories and legacies and resets to work in the next game. I did the thing I find increasingly useful, or increasingly inevitable in the design phase of this. I went and did lots of crazy over-the-top ideas, by which, you know, now I'm canny enough to realise that only 40% of them should make it into the game, and only 20% of them will make it into the game. And then halfway through, I went to Lottie and said, Lottie, I'm trying to work out what the actual intended experience of having an immortal enemy as well as an immortal mentor in New Game Plus is in the game. And we knocked it back and forth, and Lottie said, well, you basically want the player to feel like got a Moriarty, don't you? And that's it. So in the earlier game, in the standard game, you've got detectives and you've got rivals, and occasionally you've got an escape summoning. And both of these, you know, can be game over, but they are fundamentally just cards. They fundamentally, you know, in a way that's baked into the engine of the game, have to wait around for a verb to give them the time of day. If the suspicion card never pops up, then the detective can't harm you. If you actually are cheaty and use the mouse to, that's a mouse, it's a device attached to a computer. If you use a mouse I need to gesture with it, I don't know why. If you use the mouse to hang on to the card, you can actually cheese it from going into the token at all. So very early in the design, I said, I want the long to have their own verb. So the whole time you're playing against the long, they have a card, but the card is never on the board. You can't pick them up, you can't move them about, you can't put them into other things. They sit there imperviously in their own verb, occasionally snatching out other cards on the board or emitting other verbs that will make your life unpleasant. And the closest thing like that existing in the game right now, two things, I guess, really. One is time. The sundial's shadow, it never stops, it just keeps on doing things to you, and you can't do anything other than feed it funds. The other thing, of course, is you, the player. You are above and apart from the board. Nobody's going to move you around. Just keep on doing things to the board. So I wanted the long to feel almost like there's another player in the game, although obviously it's much more limited, its interactions. And the long behaves in, it does 4 things. So there are 4 things about the way it acts, which I hope will be important. They are varied, they are semi-predictable, they are responsive, and they rise to a crescendo. So I'm going to be working next week, sometime in January, on balancing this and making sure it all works out. But you've got a very stunted set of attacks in there in the alpha at the moment for the long. But if you're facing an opponent, there's no chance of me actually doing sophisticated AI. What I've got in there is sort of basic sort of state machine stuff that works in all the verbs. So I wanted it to have a variety of attacks. So it will do different things. It's not just, you can't evolve a simple strategy that will deal with it. You do have to think about different ways to respond to it. Even if some of its attacks are trivial, then it will hopefully keep you a bit off balance, and occasionally it will throw something that you haven't actually seen before. I wanted it to be semi-predictable. I want it to be possible often to get an idea of what the log is going to do to you next before it does it, just so you can build up an apathenic sense of a character at work in the game. And so you can know that it's going to do some sort of assault if you bother to send a spy, physical assault as opposed to an intrigue or a dream attack. And you know what those kind of things are going to be. And then you can see that it's starting to do an attack and you do respond to it. So the more time, at least this is what Monster Kingdom Death or Kingdom Monster Death or whatever the hell the order you put the words in, taught me about card-driven NPCs. If you can see what it's going to do, you often impute more motivation to it. So that's what I'm aiming for. What was the third thing I said? Fourth thing was rise to a crescendo. Third thing was it's responsive. Okay.
So I was looking at pictures of me dressed as a bee.
Right. You dressed as a bee?
Yeah, someone at Slackbox made it.
Right. I don't think you should look at the internet ever again.
Chat. It's fine.
Tiny Healer was along, it's true. Okay. So the responsive thing, I think I could go nuts on this, and I'm not going to, largely because I'm sharing a flat with Lottie, who I'm slightly frightened of, and she saved me from my own worst excesses. I could easily spend a year on building really interesting, sophisticated, pseudo-AI NPC opponents that are very well balanced, and I don't have that time. This is a free update. It's too big already, but I wanted to add a lot of replayability for veteran players, and I'm having to do a hard limit on what I actually put in it. So you won't, for example, probably be able to seduce long. I'd love to be able to build that in, but it's just unlikely to happen. But within those very hard limits, I wanted the long to feel responsive. So the simplest thing they do there is that if they attack you and you don't do anything, then you will suffer some damage. You know, they'll nick some money, or you'll get some dread, that sort of thing, because they're intimidating you. But if you defend yourself, then they will take that as resistance. They'll start taking you more seriously, and they'll up the ante. Their might or their connections or their starlight will increase, and you'll end up suffering increasingly severe attacks. Now, of course, then the strategy is just to deal with the nuisance stuff and never actually defend yourself against them, and that's not interesting. So over time, gradually, they will ramp up their attacks anyway as they take you more seriously. So I used this mechanic with rivals that meant that the rivals can't be treated as subverted and are a ticking bomb to an extent. That you can do things about them that may upset them, or you can leave them alone, but they'll probably get upset on their own in the end. So there's this gradually rising ante, and trying to balance the attacks that occur at the point that's interesting in the playthrough is a tricky one. I suspect it'll be a bit wonky when it goes live, but we'll see how it goes. So there's a couple of other ways that they'll respond to you in terms of your behaviour, which I will not spoil now, because you've only got 13 minutes left in the stream. The final thing is crescendo. If the long just sits there, occasionally spitting enemies at you, oh, here's a fun thing. I thought the other day it's going to be great if the long could grab detectives and teach them tenacious or mystic. Anyway, if the long's sitting there and occasionally grabbing detectives and teaching them tenacious or mystic, or firing thugs at you, or stealing your funds, or whatever, then it's a bit anticlimactic. You want some sort of climax. And also, people are going to want the option to knock the long off their perch. An unkillable NPC who just fires monsters at you gets tedious over 12 hours of play. You want the personal satisfaction of doing something to them. So if you get the long upset enough, if you wait around too long, it will come down and try to get to you. It still stays in its verb, but it will do a really quite savage attack. It'll try to grab health and injure it every 30 seconds. And you can feed it high-end NPCs, hirelings in the first version, which made things too easy. So you can't feed it hirelings anymore. The hirelings are not stupid enough to go up against an ancient long. You can feed it your followers, and if you can feed it enough followers in time and are fairly lucky, you can probably kill it. But it's chancy, right? The probabilities could easily work out wrong. So it's not necessarily something you want. Anyway, this is a fairly standard game design thing. This is the ghost in the Spelunky levels. If you piss about too long, then something will come and get you. And deciding how tough that something should be is then a difficult balancing task. So that's the last thing I wanted to crescendo. The next game. We haven't decided what our next game will be. As I've said in other places, we have a couple of ideas, and so we'll probably set on something completely different anyway. But obviously what we do will be something narrative-y. And in terms of story, repeatable story, events, legacies, and beginning the game again, here's the problem. If you see the same story over and over again, you get bored of it. If you don't see the same story over and over again, you run out of it. If you try to generate story, then there is a hard limit on what you can meaningfully do. And this is the whole point of using mechanics and narrative in an interwoven way. But if you believe that you can always improve a mechanical set of events by handcrafting bits of narrative and putting them on top and around and enhancing it, then you always want some element of handcrafted narrative, which then kind of repeats or not repeated. So I think what I'm going to do next game to try to get the most out of this and to try to provide a decent environment to test in, where you can iterate fairly quickly, is something like there is a bounded context. Let's call it an igloo full of snails. So it's not going to be an igloo, and the characters aren't going to be snails. But let's say it's an igloo full of snails, and outside is Alaska. And in the igloo full of snails, the individual snails will die, and more snails will come in from Alaska. And so you'll get small scale stories that keep repeating. If all the snails die, the igloo gets populated with more snails. Some of whom you may have seen before, because often death will not be death; it'll be exiting stage left, and you'll bring them back in. But you can reset the stuff inside. It's fairly interesting, and the stuff outside keeps going on. It doesn't reset, and it's fundamentally less interesting because it's not inside the igloo with you, but it proceeds towards a story ending. So it's not just like, you know, faction numbers going up and down, which is what a lot of people try to do in this sort of context. There is a larger narrative which proceeds. You have to go through several generations worth of snails in order to reach the end of it. Now, to be absolutely clear, this game is not going to be set in Alaska. It's going to be set in. It's not going to be set in an igloo. And if it features any snails, they'll be purely peripheral parts of it. They're not going to be, the characters aren't actually going to be snails. But Alaska, the igloo and snails can stand in for the kind of thing I'm talking about. So I think that's the thing. I want to be able to iterate very quickly and see what happens when the snails get crushed or changed into pineapples, and then do different dynamics based on that. But I want to be able to write a longish form story that people will be able to push forwards. They'll feel there's some general sort of progress. And then, of course, you can repeat the whole story if you want anyway, because there's no way of stopping them from repeating a story from the beginning if they want to, even if you wanted to, short of going around the house and destroying their computer with a sledgehammer, which I understand is something our lawyers advise against. I think that's all I got for today. So
some questions for you.
Hit me with questions.
Okay, so we have the highest rated question from Matthew, which is, will the nowhere hours ever appear more in game?
I would like them to.
Okay, moving on. From Dedivax, will you be tweaking or rebalancing the standard ascensions now that you're adding advanced ones?
A little bit, but not much. I'd like to spend a lot more time rebalancing them, but there are finite hours in the day, finite days in the week, finite weeks in the month, and I want to get Cultist Simulator a good place to leave for a while by April. So I expect I'll never leave it entirely. So some small rebalances, but I wouldn't expect anything big.
The important question here from Mark. Can we expect more words from the one who wrote the truly terrific romance endings?
The mysterious guest author. Yeah, she was amazing. I think she was a she, wasn't she? I mean, I'd certainly like her to be.
I think we should give her more work. If you could go back, this is from Gladys, if you could go back and change one thing about Cultist Simulator before you released it, what would it be? I would make funds more of a bottleneck and provide more drains, more randomized drains to deal with it. One from Morgan. What are the other great works? We know of the Dawnbreaker device. What's the Grail flavored one and the Lantern-lit one? I mentioned it, and then the Lantern one is the third one, the other one. Okay. This is from, oh gosh, I apologize in advance. Maciej Jaromin? Maciej Jaromin, probably. Maciej Jaromin. I can't get the vowels right. Does Marinette actually speak in Grail emojis, or was that just a placeholder? No, she actually speaks in Grail emojis. So this is interesting. Mildly interesting. It's interesting to me. So you fuckers haven't put up with it. I'm writing the in square brackets meta text instructions for long stuff, and I have to say at one point, square brackets, you can feed aspect, I can't remember, lantern, moth, and grail probably followers into this slot to spy on the long, or you can feed winter, edge, and forge to attack them, something like that. And it's a lot of fucking words, right? So it's word salad in the middle of them. Nobody's okay, barely even fitted in the page, tiny text.
So I just thought I'd resurrect an idea that we talked about in the very, very early days of Cultist Simulator we never looked at, which is just to put the sprites in the text. And I found to my delight that TextMesh Pro in Unity supports that quite handily. You have to put together a sprite sheet and then stick it in, but then after that, TMP does most of the work. So it's now possible to put sprites in inline in text. And I'm reserving that largely for the New Game Plus stuff, major ascensions, for two reasons. First of all, I think it's confusing to see this sort of civilization-esque shorthand of, heart icon, cup icon at the beginning when you first come to the game in the text. But the much bigger reason is consistency. If I do it sometimes, but not other times in the earlier game, it's going to look really shonky, and I don't have time to go through and change it all reliably. So it's probably just going to be there. But then having put it in there, there are, as you'll probably have seen, the keen review for my Twitter teasers, three formidable older women who make an appearance, one in each of the major victories. One of them is kind of maternal and formidable.
Love her.
She's probably my favourite, although she does eat people. One of them is sort of academic and forceful. And it's hard to differentiate formidable, forceful older women in 3 lines of text without making them into caricatures. So one of them went for this more sort of grandmother you wouldn't fuck with. One of them, the model for the sketch he did for her is actually based on the founder of the International Red Cross, who was great and a very, very effective woman. And Sulochana, who you folks know of old, again is is based on a couple of older Indian women of my acquaintance who I'm extremely intimidated by. But all these sort of intimidating things, you want different flavour for them. So for Marinette, I really wanted something that just made her taciturn and formidable, but didn't make her sound like Sulochana or Mrs. E. Or Flash Thistle, or for that matter, Poppy, who was already a bit like a kid now. So I hit upon the happy medium of the ground emoji. So it is now the case that let me phrase this extremely carefully, the figure that presents as Marinette in the Grail major ascension plot line is usefully represented as speaking only in these glyphs. That's the answer to the question.
All right, I have one more question for you before we should wrap this up. And I'm asking it because everyone's going nuts because I haven't asked it yet. So
you can't marry worms.
The final question, no, it's not that. The final
doesn't seem very fair.
Don't you start.
It was a giant alien
a
worm.
worm activist here in the corner. But the final question of this month's stream is, did the twins drown?
The thing about the twins is one of the twins is both the